In this episode, we're going to be looking at the book from which I took our opening quote. Actually, it's a couple of books. I'm going to be talking about C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, in particular the first two books, Out of the Silent Planet and Perelandra. My history with science fiction is pretty long-standing, but I can't say that I have read a lot of science fiction. As a child, I was really into Jules Verne. I read a bunch of his books, and then as I got a little older, I read all of the major works by H.G. Wells, and then more recently in college, I watched Star Trek, both the original series and Next Generation, and I've seen, I think, 2 out of 3 of the newest films that are supposed to be prequels to the original series. But that's pretty much as far as I've got with science fiction. It's not that I don't love the genre, because I really do. I think for me, it's just a matter of finding really well-written science fiction that takes me past just world building in science and talks about bigger subjects and stuff that we can relate to here on Earth. But yeah, world building, discovery, first contact, new technologies, and then those parallels between other worlds and ours. These are the reasons that I enjoy science fiction, and those are the kind of things that I look for when I'm reading or watching science fiction. After reading the first 2 books in C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, I think that they fall more under what I would call Christian science fantasy as opposed to science fiction per se, but they're generally labeled under science fiction, and they're also very episodic, so you can kind of read each book by itself. So I thought I would go ahead and talk about the first 2 books. I'm still reading the last one, and I think I'll save that for a separate episode. Out of the Silent Planet starts in England, like all great science fiction does. No, I'm serious though. I do enjoy books that start out in England, especially if we're talking fantasy or science fiction, because that transition from old world to new is just so much more startling and so much more interesting, really. So we start in England, and it's the interwar period, so sometime after World War I, but before World War II. And we get to meet Ransom, this guy named Ransom, who finds himself in a very strange situation. Ransom is in a walking tour in England, and he meets up with an old acquaintance named Davine. And what ends up coming out of this reacquaintance is Ransom gets kidnapped by Davine and Professor Weston, Davine's friend, and Ransom gets taken to Malacandra against his will for mysterious purposes that Davine and Weston will not reveal to him. Malacandra is the, quote, old solar name for the planet Mars, so Ransom is really going to Mars. And this is where he experiences what we would call first contact, or in his case, second contact, if you count Davine and Weston as the first people to go to Mars. And he meets 3 very different species on Mars. And what Davine and Weston didn't take into account is that Ransom is a philologist, he studies languages, and he's generally curious, and he's pretty open-minded in comparison to them. So what starts out as a nightmare kind of turns into this sort of voyage of discovery where Ransom intermingles with species on Mars and gets to know these different types of Hanau. Hanau is the solar word for what they call intelligent life, or sort of not necessarily humanoid species, but species that are considered to be persons as opposed to animals. So there's 3 different type of Hanau, or intelligent life, on Malacandra. Ransom gets to meet the Hrassa. The Hrassa are otter-like primitive characters. They look like otters, is what I mean. And they are very personable, kind of like animals. but they are also artists and poets and musicians, and that's kind of their calling in Malacandra, to be the poets and musicians. Another species of Hanau on Mars are the Saroni. The Saroni are much more intimidating to Ransom. They are giants and they are intellectual, and when he gets there, he has no idea if they are friend or foe. And then finally, there are the Fifiltrigi, the miners and makers. So the Fifiltrigi mine for minerals and they make things, and they're pretty cool. So these are the types of entities that Ransom encounters on Mars, and the types of people whose languages he tries to learn. One thing that you don't always get in science fiction is an encounter of a spiritual side or a spiritual world. Oftentimes in science fiction, you might get species that are non-physical. They're like spirits. But what C.S. Lewis does in the Space Trilogy is he goes beyond talking about beings that are spirits or invisible or omniscient. What he's talking about here is an actual spiritual realm where you've got the Eldila, who are like angels that are just barely visible to human eye, and also this strange and mysterious entity called Oyarsa, who is a powerful figure on Malacandra, whom Ransom is destined to meet. And I called this series Christian Science Fantasy at the start of this episode, and one thing that was interesting is how C.S. Lewis tries to take Christianity and just sort of imagine what it would be like if it were on other planets. And I had mixed feelings about that concept, and I will probably go into that in more detail a little later on, but I just thought that was an interesting take on the typical science fiction narrative. So that's basically the whole setting of Out of the Silent Planet, this first book in the Space Trilogy. Out of the Silent Planet it pretty much encompasses what I would expect from science fiction, those themes of discovery and first contact and technology that I mentioned earlier. But I kind of found it to be a slightly boring book, and I guess that goes back to me not being really into world building, or maybe world building of this kind. Like I said, I'm not a big fan of exposition. I know it's necessary to explain things, but I kind of felt some of that was tedious in this book. But also, I felt like the stakes in this book were kind of low, and the conflict was quickly resolved. Without giving away any spoilers, I just kind of feel like there could have been more in this book, and it could have had a more interesting plot. So yeah, I had to deduct some stars just because of that tedious factor. One thing I really enjoyed in Out of the Silent Planet was the depiction of interspecies relationships, and I would say my favorite parts were the scenes that showed the contrast between the betrayal Ransom experienced in the hands of Davine and Weston versus the bonding between Ransom and the Hrasa, or the otter-like entities. And these themes of companionship and courage and brotherhood are essential, I think, to science fiction, because when you're out on the final frontier and you don't have other humans around, you feel really alone, and it kind of brings the foreignness down to earth, and in a way it takes what is mysterious and unknown and makes it universal and something that Ransom can understand and relate to, because in the end all the Hanau, the intelligent life, are in some way similar. So I thought that was really neat. I really enjoyed those scenes. There's this one moment in particular when Ransom is out hunting with the Hrasa, and he feels that bond very strongly, and it's described, quote, "Whatever happened, he must show that the human species were also Hanau. He was only too aware that such resolutions might look very different when the moment came, but he felt an unwanted assurance that somehow or other he would be able to go through with it. It was necessary, and the necessary was always possible. This calls to mind Picard's quote from one of the episodes in Star Trek where he says, "It's only impossible until it's not." So that distinctly human characteristic of determination and belief in the impossible is what makes Ransom such a great explorer and also a true hero in the science fiction genre. To me, what makes a great series or trilogy or any type of continuous storyline is having a great main character. So even though I didn't really love Out of the Silent Planet, I had high hopes going into Perelandra, and I was not disappointed. Although I did end up giving them both 3 stars, and maybe I'll talk about a little bit why I did that later on. But I did enjoy Perelandra more, and I think having a great character like Ransom makes the whole series much more readable than it otherwise would be. So in Perelandra, we have a very different setting and a very different beginning. Ransom goes to Perelandra of his own free will, Perelandra being Venus. Perelandra is the old solar name for Venus. Perelandra is a young world in comparison. It's made up greatly of these floating islands, which are basically like reed-like blankets of land that conform to waves, and so you're always walking on these waves of islands, which is pretty cool. There are lots of animals and exotic plants. There's friendly dragons, which was really neat. And always Ransom notices how beautiful the world is, how beautiful the sky is, and how dazzling the light and darkness are to him. So it's a very vivid place, sort of a paradise, if you will, which has more implications than one as the story goes on. So the basic story here is Ransom meets one of the inhabitants of Perelandra, the Green Lady, who is indeed green, and he gets caught up in a story that is on the surface very simplistic, again, kind of a first contact type of tale, but it turns into this psychological and at times physical battle of temptation versus faith. So I gotta say that if you're looking for great female characters, you should always read C.S. Lewis. He always seems to get them right. They're never perfect. They're not like Mary Sue's, but they're always strong in their own way, and there's a wide range of female characters that he writes, which I could go into in a different episode. I think that would be an interesting topic. Female characters in literature, which has been done a lot, but I think C.S. Lewis doesn't get enough credit. The Green Lady is very feminine, but not stereotypically so. She's kind of ageless. She seems to be something between a little girl and a mother. She's innocent, but she's also wise like a child. Though she's emotionally vulnerable, which Ransom sees happening over the course of time, she's also got this power to her, this sort of spiritual powerfulness. In fact, in one scene, Ransom feels like running to the Green Lady for protection from the bad guy, which is not necessarily what you'd expect in a situation like this. And I thought that was really interesting that, here you've got a character who is both strong and weak, and kind of for the same reasons, her innocence. So the Green Lady is living in this gorgeous paradise world, and here we see a lot of world building from C.S. Lewis, not a lot of technology. I did enjoy the world he described. I love the floating islands, like I said earlier, and the trees that have fruit that are like bubbles of water, where Ransom takes a shower, and all the dolphin-like fish that you can ride on and that are friendly to humans. I thought that was fun. And still, he paints this image of a world of mystery and, again, a spiritual side that is ever present, although not necessarily in a physically identifiable sense. One of the themes that this book talks about is the idea that some experiences and pleasures are priceless, and that to put a price on them would be wrong, and the best that you can do is just enjoy it and be content. Kind of like living in the moment and not trying to be covetous about it. So in one case, Ransom is eating some delicious berries that he finds that are edible, and he notices some of them are really, really good, perhaps very ripe or in some ways better than the others. And he says on Earth they'd soon discover how to breed them, meaning the berries, which kind of is a precursor to our current controversies around GMO. There is a distinct absence of commercialism on Perelandra. There's no sense of economy because there's no need for it. And there's this idea too that Lewis alludes to, that technology can lead to the dangers of commercialism and just wanting to make money off of everything. And I think we see that a lot in our current society, and it was probably something that he was thinking about back in the 40s, 30s or 40s when he was writing this. The idea that the beautiful concept of technology being about discovery is replaced by this greed to make money off of it to an unreasonable extent, where you've lost the beauty that you first encountered, whether it's the technology itself or what that technology has allowed you to find in the world. So the Green Lady and her paradise garden are the beautiful, pure elements in Perelandra. But later on, Ransom meets a demon-possessed man, and I'm not going to go deep into how he meets him or who he is or any of that, because I feel like that would be going into spoiler territory. But I did think it was kind of an interesting concept to have a character who's sort of demon-possessed in this otherwise pure and innocent land. This sinister character is described as looking like a very dead person, not a sick person, but a dead person, like a body without a human in it. And even though Ransom knows this man's real name, Ransom takes to calling him the, quote, unman, referenced in our opening quote. Ransom's encounter with this demonic unman kind of changes how he views evil. In one scene, he thinks, quote, he had never before seen anything but half-hearted and uneasy attempts at evil. This creature was whole-hearted. The extremity of its evil had passed beyond all struggle into some state which bore a horrible similarity to innocence. So, Ransom likens the unman not to a superhuman villain like a Sauron, but more to like this psychopath or to even a nagging schoolboy at one point. And it kind of reminded me a lot of what G.K. Chesterton said in his essay, Eugenics and Other Evils. He said, quote, evil always wins through the strength of its splendid dupes, and there has, in all ages, been a disastrous alliance between abnormal innocence and abnormal sin. I'm not really sure how I feel about that statement, but it's kind of interesting to see that two people who were roughly contemporaries came to very similar conclusions. And if you look at the world events of that time and the experimentation that was going on, and of course the brutalities to come of Nazi Germany, you can see why the British writers of that period had these fears of technology and also this particular impression of what evil was. And it reminds me a lot of the book that I talked about in my last episode, The Sea Wolf by Jack London. And in that book, there's the character of Wolf Larsen, who is also very evil, but kind of in an amoral sense or a non-moral manner. It's kind of like they don't have any sense of right and wrong, not in an innocent way, but in an evil way. The parallel between the Sea Wolf and Perelandra goes even further, because this unman in Perelandra is very cruel to animals just for the sake of it. He goes around and hurts birds and frogs and anything just because he can. And it's to the point that it shocks even Ransom, who Lewis says had been at the Battle of the Somme in World War I. I'm currently reading Book 3 of the Space Trilogy, which is called That Hideous Strength. And early on in the book, it mentions that the sinister organization, the NICE, or NICE so-called, practices vivisection. And I feel like what happened in Perelandra is kind of a prelude to that. Vivisection, like eugenics, was a very controversial topic in science in the Victorian era and afterwards. I read an interesting essay not long ago called Some Popular Fallacies About Vivisection, and it's by Lewis Carroll of all people. He makes some really good arguments against it and gives some examples of why he feels like vivisection is dangerous, not just for animals, but for the people performing these live surgeries. So I really recommend you reading it if you can find it, to give you some kind of insider's guide on what was going on during this time and why it was such a controversial topic of the day. So Perelandra is a very short book. It's not even 200 pages in the edition that I have, but it's chock full of these fascinating topics, thought-provoking themes like predestination, free will, the physical versus the spiritual worlds, and mythology versus fact. And it gave me a lot to think about. I will say there were some parts in this Garden of Eden story that made me a bit uncomfortable. I felt like in some cases Lewis did a little too much blending of mythology and Christianity for my comfort level, I guess. And I think I saw this in Narnia a little bit. Lewis makes what I think is the mistake of being too specific with his allegory. I think he forces himself to explain too many things, and I think some of these things he just can't explain satisfactorily. And I think that, personally, I think that's something that a lot of writers fall into. They try to explain too much. They don't allow for enough mystery. And I know there's that desire in science fiction to spell things out and to explain to the reader everything about their world. But I think it is going to be a better choice in many cases to allow there to be some mystery and not try to explain everything, especially if you're talking about Christianity and other planets. I don't know. It was just, I thought it was a very strange way that he blended the two, and I don't know, that was just me. I know it's just fantasy, but again, I think he could have said the same things, but with less speculation, or less, not even speculation, but less fantasy, I guess, is what I'm going for here. And I can't go too deeply into that because I think it would be spoiler territory, but just one sort of vague example. There's this one scene where Ransom uses physical force instead of spiritual force, and that kind of seemed wrong to me given the circumstances and given sort of a biblical perspective, but that's again my opinion. And I felt like Lewis was very sincere with his narrative, and he brought up a lot of questions that take the story beyond your typical fantasy or science fiction. So if you can read Perelandra critically, I think there's lots of gems in this book, and it's just sort of really a great way to think about the world from a slightly different perspective, and not just the world, but also what it means to have faith. So that's it for Out of the Silent Planet and Perelandra, the first two books in the Space Trilogy. I'm currently reading the last book, as I said, That Hideous Strength, and I'm really enjoying that one quite a bit more than these two, even though it's very different so far. So I will be back with another episode on the last book, and I hope you've enjoyed this trip to Malacandra and Perelandra. I hope you have a great week, and see you in my next episode.